Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and strategies that you can apply from discussing the research of esteemed leadership experts and practitioners so that you can take your leadership to the next level. My goal is that what we discuss will be immediately actionable and useful to you, and I'd love to hear what you're planning on implementing. Today, I'm very glad to be joined by Dr. John Austin, who is the PD Merrill Endowed Chair of Business at the University of New England. Prior to that, he was in the School of Leadership Studies at the Fielding Graduate University. He's also worked as a principal at Decision Strategies International and a management professor at Penn State University. He has published in leading management and applied psychology journals, such as the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science, Journal of Applied Psychology, and HR Magazine. Welcome, John, to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Charles. A pleasure to be here.
So today, I love this conversation to be around the fundamental leadership trap and really unpacking your great book, which is titled Unquestioned Brilliance. But in this context, it's not a positive connotation, right? It's more of a not so flattering context. Can you unpack what you mean or define unquestioned brilliance in this context?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I'll say it was a really fun title for a book because for quite a while I was giving talks, I would be introduced as the author of Unquestioned Brilliance. So really, it was just one long joke, I suppose. Unquestioned brilliance in this context is where we don't question what we actually know. So getting to what you said, you mentioned about the fundamental leadership trap that I talk about in Unquestioned Brilliance is that there's a path of cognitive least resistance, that if we're not reflective and thoughtful about how we think, how we make decisions, we end up in this cycle where we very quickly make sense of what we think we see. And we use a very limited frame based on our own experience to decide what's in front of us. We then look for evidence we're right. That's the confirmation bias. We're brilliant at finding evidence we're right. And so we will. And that leads us to become increasingly confident that our first hypothesis was correct. And so that cycle is actually the cycle that leads to this idea of unquestioned brilliance. We think we know the answer. We look for evidence that we do know the answer. We find it. And then we just continue in this cycle, which is really the cycle that drives overconfidence. And overconfidence really is kind of the core thing that I've really tried to grapple with in my career as a researcher and as a practitioner.
Now, is this a struggle for every leader, or is it just for those egotistical megalomaniacs that really struggle with this? What have you found?
No, actually, I love that question. Those egotistical megalomaniacs are the ones we like to pick on because they don't even seem to be aware that they're in this cycle. But my argument is that we all struggle with this, that anyone who has a history of some successful decisions falls into a pattern and a habit where they no longer think about how they're making those decisions. And so my point is that any one of us can find pathways out of that trap. And here's the real sticking point for this is that if it is the case that many of us are in this trap, when we put ourselves together in a room with other people, that doesn't necessarily help things. We just kind of all feed into this cycle. And so we need to have some tools and techniques to not just get us out of this cycle of overconfidence and confirmation bias, but to make sure that our groups and our organizations don't also fall into these traps.
That's great. I'd love for you to go through the example that I've heard you give a couple times in some of your programs about what college sport did you play that really demonstrates these issues that you've just described. So if you wouldn't mind unpacking that, and I can even play along and role play with you just to give our listeners some insight into that. And really how this uncovers these biases. I love that, how that does that. So I'll turn it over to you.
Right. Sure. So first of all, for those of you, I know many of you are just listening to this, so you can't see what I look like, but I'll tell you that I'm about 5'7", 140 pounds. Okay. So you can sort of have that image there. And so often when I'm with groups of people, I will ask them to just guess what sport I played in college. And see what people come up with. And as you can imagine, I don't know Charles, what would you guess? What sport I played in college? Would you guess as a
Let's say golf, lacrosse. I'll say those two.
lacrosse. I get an awful lot of cross country, track and field. The really humorous thing is when I'm traveling internationally, I often get ping pong, and people always say chess as well. So the point of that exercise is not what sport I played as much as it is how people come to that choice. And the way people come to the guess of what sport I played is they just look at me and they don't know much else about me. And they have a mental model in their head of what athletes look like, and they just run me through that file until they find a match. And that's their guess. And there's nothing wrong with that. We have to do that all of the time. We have to make decisions based on incomplete information. Where that gets interesting, though, is that if I let people think about that for 10 minutes and I don't tell them any more information about myself after they've made a guess, many of those people will come back far more confident that their initial guess is correct. And I've even had people actually argue with me after I tell them what sport I played and say, no, that's not right. You must have played soccer. So people get really invested in this guess that they make after about 10 minutes with no more information. And that's fascinating to me. Why does that happen? And there was a study that this is based on where people were randomly assigned a point of view for a particular issue. And those people that were given 10 minutes to think about that decision or that choice argued far more passionately for their randomly assigned position than those people who were distracted during those 10 minutes. And when I say they didn't argue better, they didn't make better arguments, they held the position more strongly, even though it was randomly assigned to them. This suggests that what we're doing in that 10 minutes is we're rationalizing, thinking for how we must be right. We're looking for all of the reasons that if I picked track and field, that John Austin probably ran track and field. And so it's an example of how we just naturally fool ourselves. Once we have publicly stated an opinion, we want to be right. And so we really spend our time rationalizing and looking for evidence that we are right, so we don't have to publicly change our opinion. So that's that story. And you can sort of see how that cycle would work. There's an initial hypothesis. We publicly state what our opinion is on that hypothesis. We then seek out information that we're right. If there's no data, we rationalize why we're probably right. We're very good at rationalizing, so we become more confident that we are correct with that.
And would you mind letting listeners know what sport was it?
Of course. I was a wrestler in college, and you wrestle by weight class. So that does make sense. Wrestlers come in all sizes. And what I like to say is that I was the heavyweight. So I was actually the weight class that the NCAA dropped because they no longer make adults my size. So.
Oh, that's great. I love that illustration of that cognitive process. Like you said, that's one of the biggest challenges to becoming an effective leader. And really this identifies that cognitive path of least resistance. And if you publicly state it, or if you give yourself more time, you become more confident of that initial guess and try to identify that evidence, that confirming evidence that's going to support that initial assumption that you made. And this really kind of goes into that this cycle feeds upon itself, right? Because once you start to find evidence that you are correct, you're going to grow more confident with that initial frame. And it's all about the frames you have, right? And trying to break free from some of those frames or the way that you see the world.
Right, precisely. And it's that recognition that whenever you walk into a new situation, you simplify what's there. You cannot take everything in. So you actively are looking at certain things and choosing not to look at other things. And so for many years, we've referred to these as frames. This idea of a frame, you can think of that as a frame of a house, but I like to think of it as a window frame, because the image here is that if you're standing inside and looking through a window, there's a whole world out there, but you can only see one small part of it. And why I think it's useful to pursue that image is now imagine that you just take a small 1-foot step to your right, and everything you see out of that window is now shifted. You see a completely different set of things with just that little subtle shift. And if you start to think of that's what we need to get in the habit of doing, when we walk into a new room, assess what we see, and then pause for a moment and try to look at it from a different perspective, and just start building that habit with new decisions, with new situations, and these types of things.
So leaders really can counter their limited frames by cultivating two skills that you mentioned, frame breaking and frame triggering, right?
Oh, absolutely. And of course, frame breaking almost needs to happen first for you to recognize the need for frame triggering action, right? But as leaders, what this suggests to us is that we need to work on ourselves and our own ability to sort of work from multiple perspectives. And this idea of then that you can become more persuasive when you understand the perspectives of multiple stakeholders starts to get to that idea of frame triggering as well as a path forward to drive strategic action.
I love that. There was an example that you gave that I really liked in your book regarding the iron fish and that trying to get out of that frame, right? Or break into new frames, having that eureka moment. Because a lot of people, when they look at innovation, which is they look at the eureka moment, they look at that it's been glamorized, it's the aha moment, it's the frame shifting or frame breaking moment. But even though it's been glamorized and probably overemphasized, though the breakthrough is not sometimes not the hardest part of the innovation process, right? That breakthrough moment. So I'd love for you to kind of one, give us more insight around that Eureka breakthrough moment, and then talk to us about what do you think is the hardest part of the innovation process, because it still deals with this concept of frames and trying to break through the traditional frames that you have.
Right. So when you break a frame, you suddenly feel like you see something new. You see the world differently. That's what this experience of the Eureka moment is, this sudden moment of discovery. And there are many of us can probably think of times in our lives when that happened. And the thing about that is it is instantaneous. And when we focus on that idea of the Eureka moment, it does, in a sense, simplify too much the work that has to go into innovation, because that's just the start of the process. But some of them are really powerful to think about how quickly it can happen. And when I talk about the story of the lucky ironfish, which is it's actually a company based in Canada that emerged out of this work that was initially some nonprofit work to work with childhood anemia, to try to reduce the incidence of childhood anemia in developing nations. And the story that they tell is that they went into these rural communities, and these researchers they introduced this idea that to counter childhood anemia, really what you need to do is just get iron into people's diet to a larger degree. And we've known this for many years, and there's been many interventions to try to address this. Initially, they went in with a block of iron and into these communities, and they said, put this block of iron in the water that you're using to prepare your family's meal. And then they came back 6 months later and they found that no one was using this block of iron. And to their credit, they then did not just repeat their presentation and say it's really, really important. Instead, what they did is they worked with the communities to understand why it was they were not using this iron block. And you can imagine some of the responses they got. It's, you don't feed iron to your family. If we don't eat metal, it just seemed like a weird thing to do. But they did learn that people really did care about the health of their children, obviously. And they also learned that there was this pervasive conversation about luck that was part of the culture. And so they created an iron fish. Now fish go in water. And they created this fish to be the lucky iron fish. And the idea was you put the fish in the water as you're preparing your family's meal. And it will bring your family good luck and it will help your family's health. And what they found was that when they came back, they had uptake of over 90% with this very simple change. Now, that to me is a eureka moment. That is that you have a solution, which is a block of iron, and you realize that it's not working. And how do you discover what will work? Well, you go talk to the users and you learn from them. And that's the eureka. And I'd love to sort of hear that story from the person who in the moment said, wait a minute, let's make it look like a fish. This has now turned into first a global nonprofit and then a for-profit company. That's a really long story though, right? And it's really just about the eureka moment.
And the eureka moment though is really an example of frame shifting, because had they not shifted their frame of thinking, they would have kept trying, like you stated, this same solution and just emphasize the importance of it to say, you really need to do this. How can I tell you how important this is in terms that you'll understand and actually apply, versus just saying, wait a minute, let's shift our frame here. Let's rethink this. And then to have that eureka moment really coincided with them shifting that frame of thinking to something that was actually more successful, right?
Well, and think about how often we do this in trying to create change in our organizations. We design a communication plan and then we push it out to an organization and no one changes. And we have this, it just stalls out. And so what do? We push out the same communication. We keep repeating over and over why we think this change is important. And that misses this idea that actually maybe the problem is that this isn't the right frame. We need to speak a little bit more to our target audience and maybe do some of the translation of what's in it for them. Why is this really important? And more specifically, maybe they actually already know that. They probably already understand the need for the change. Maybe they just don't actually know what you're asking them to do. And so that's really what you need to do, right?
So my big takeaway from all this, you want to have more Eureka moments, you want to be more innovative, then you got to focus on this frame shifting, frame breaking approach and activities or skills that can cultivate this more within you. So that's, I think, great. And we're going to try to get into some of those before the end of the episode. But now I wanted to go more into the overconfidence, right? And just kind of touch upon that a little bit to say that it's good to be confident as a leader. And what's the difference between self-assurance versus overconfidence so that we can identify the difference between the two and then maybe talk about the different types. And you mentioned 2 types of overconfidence because that's really a central role in the fundamental leadership trap of most leaders is this overconfidence bias.
Right. So overconfidence is a tricky one because we do want to present ourselves with assurance. We want to present ourselves confidently. And the way I like to make the distinction here is that oftentimes people talk about overconfidence is thinking you know more than you actually know. I like to think of overconfidence is not knowing how much you don't know something. That might sound like, oh, isn't that very much different? And I think it is. It's that overconfidence is that not being really clearly aware of the limits of your expertise. And so we all do have a deep expertise in something. And many of us, it's multiple things. But if you really push at it, most of us only really have deep expertise in maybe 2 or 3 things, depends how you define it. Those are the areas that we should really have some strong confidence in. Even in those areas, though, if we think about this, how do you know that your knowledge is up to date in that area? If you've always been the smartest person or the most expert person in your organization in this one area, because that's what you were hired to be, you start comparing yourself to people who never were experts in that area in the first place. And so you think that you still are an expert in that area. You should be comparing yourselves to the other experts in that area outside of your work, right? But we don't often do that. And so as a result of it, our expertise degrades over time, but our perception of our expertise degrades at a slower rate. So we recognize that we might not know quite as much about this as we did when we left graduate school, but we still don't fully understand perhaps how much that started to degrade, right? And then so that is the kind of the deep expertise. And then the real challenging part of overconfidence that I see is there's all these areas that we have shallow expertise in, and it's surface level. If you go a little bit deeper into it, there's not much there. But we think we know more in those areas than we actually know. And the only way you actually learn that is when someone pushes you to explain something in that area. And then you discover that you don't know as much as you think you know. And we refer to that as the illusion of explanatory depth. That to me is kind of a core element of overconfidence. And what really most of us need to do is kind of just learn to distinguish between those areas that we do have deep expertise and those areas where really we have a more shallow surface level expertise.
That's great. And I found this to be really effective, what you just stated, and be applied to learning and studying, right? My kids, when I was in school, I saw a lot of individual study by just reviewing the notes, looking at them. And that's that illusion of explanatory expertise that you could actually recreate this. But when you take the paper away and now you have to reproduce it, right, through quizzing, through memory, it's much more difficult. And you really find out what level of knowledge you have on something that You're not just reviewing while you're looking at it, which is a much better and more effective study technique. But many people just review their notes thinking that, okay, if I think I got it from looking at the notes, I'm going to be fine on the test. But usually that's not the case.
Think of all of the times, many of us, if you ever took a class in accounting or finance, where you just said, you know what, I'm not going to do this study problems, right? And then you pay for that on the test. It is that idea, right?
Yep. Well, let's go through some of those overconfidence traps. So the trap number one, which is very common with leaders, is we don't know what we don't know. So we need to be constantly vigilant, right? Against the temptation to believe that our understanding goes behind the actual area of expertise, just like what you just stated. One of the great examples that you provide that I think is really typical is when we watch something on the television and it's on maybe a political channel, and it's a pundit that's just talking and giving their opinion about everything. And it's really just their opinion. They might be confident with it, but it doesn't confer much expertise.
Right. That's a really great example, because those are people that get paid to pretend they know something. And I say pretend they know something. I think most of these people are very sincere, but they are being asked questions outside of their area of expertise as well. And that gets to that idea of the difference between cognitive and social overconfidence as well, because cognitive overconfidence is thinking you actually know more than you know. Social overconfidence is feeling the need to present yourself as knowledgeable, even if you know that maybe you don't know as much as you think. And I think maybe those pundits might fall sometimes more on that side. Their job is to act like they have the answer, right, with that.
Which one is harder to overcome, social or cognitive overconfidence?
Wow, that's a great question. I think because I've spent so much time in the cognitive space, I do feel like that's the harder one. It sort of sometimes gets to our self-identity to even learn the habits of questioning with that. And the other reason I would say that might be harder to overcome is that there is some evidence that certain professions lend themselves more towards overconfidence. And that suggests to me that it's actually the social situation you're in might require you to present yourself confidently. And then you start to believe your own hype, right? You start to gradually turn social overconfidence into cognitive overconfidence. And a classic example of this is medical doctors. Now, I have to say, training of medical doctors over the last 20 years has gotten immensely better because they often work on this. But no one is satisfied if their doctor says, I have no idea, right? So they have this pressure to act like they really do know something when there is a lot of uncertainty there.
Let's move to trap number two, and that is we forget what we used to not know. So this is called Monday morning quarterbacking. It's an example of on Monday, you kind of relive those games from Sunday stating, why didn't he do this? And why didn't he do that? But you're not separating the fact that at the time, you didn't have that knowledge or information, nor did they. And if they had it, they probably would have acted in that way.
Right, right.
So that's a common one, right? That you see a lot with overconfidence.
Right. So we tell people that we're very good at learning from experience, but honestly, we don't really learn from experience, from other people's experience, if what we're also thinking is, oh, I never would have done that. And so that's Monday morning quarterbacks. We criticize the quarterback for a poor play, a poor decision in our mind. But at the time, we didn't know it was a poor decision until after the fact, right? And it's very easy to assess a failure in our industry or even in our organization and look at that and say, well, we never would have done that. That was a stupid thing to do. If I was in charge, that never would have happened. That's why this is so difficult, is we have to sort of have a bit of sort of a humble approach to looking at the past and ask ourselves, well, why would we have acted the same way instead of assuming that we would act differently, right?
You're right. That's very difficult to do. And I find myself with sports teams that I like doing the same thing on Monday or Tuesday after they played.
Right.
So to overcome our unquestioned brilliance, it requires discipline. It requires us to find routines and techniques that forces us to go beyond the obvious and test our logic and assumptions. And you provide really 10 techniques to help with this process. I'd like to go over just a few of those that I think would help our listeners out. First one would be blind spot centering, which really helps the individual with the question, what if my assumptions were wrong? Can you unpack that a little bit for us? Give us an example of how to use that.
Yeah, sure. So what we do with blind spot centering is we work with the group and identify what are the core assumptions of their organization or their team. These would be the widely shared frames, I guess you could say, but also sort of expectations about the market, about competitors. We often have them work on this with what are some of the assumptions that we have about our customers, about our own organization, about our competitors. And you identify sort of the conventional wisdom and the underlying frames that really drive how the organization thinks about its environment. And then with that, what we then like to do is we like to pick one or two of those core assumptions. And oftentimes the way we do this, we pick one core assumption about customers, one about the competition, one about the organization. And we say, all right, let's now just imagine a world in which the opposite is true. And we work some way to rework what that is. What is the opposite of this assumption? And then we then work as a group to build out that world. Say, if this is in a world in which our competitors are not interested in developing the latest technology, our customers actually would prefer us to interact more with them in person and to offer fewer products, okay? And whatever it is, you build out then what are the assumptions of that kind of opposite world? Once you do that, you then can hold up these two lists of assumptions. And what you start to see is that there's some overlap and that there are some assumptions that play across both your core assumption world and then your world that is anchored off of what I refer to as your blind spots, okay? And this may seem like kind of a weird exercise, but what it usually highlights is that some of those core assumptions that we're working off of are not really as solid as we think they are. And that if we start trying to imagine a world in which those assumptions don't hold, we may actually see some unique and innovative strategic directions that we can take. And we also might start to see some of those weak signals that suggest that maybe our industry is shifting in one direction or another.
I love that technique. How about let's move to uncertainty vectoring, which helps an individual with the question, what if the future plays out differently than what they're predicting?
Yeah, so and uncertainty vectoring draws from my experience working with scenario planning as well. And so some of your listeners here might be familiar with scenario planning. And in this, what we do is we start with identifying a core set of forces, a core set of uncertainties that will drive the direction of let's say our industry over the next 5 years, or it could be 10 years or whatever the time horizon is you're looking at. With uncertainty vectoring, what we do is we have this technique where we take those uncertainties, we first center where we are right now in those uncertainties. So maybe much of the uncertainty is in a single direction, maybe it is multi-directional. And then what we can do is we can kind of start to figure out how those uncertainties correlate with each other. We lay that out on a single sheet of paper to align how these uncertainties look on this map where their correlation is connected based obviously on how closely the lines are together. And after you've done that work, and it's kind of fun work because what you're doing as a group is you're arguing about how these core uncertainties fit together and interact with each other, much like you would do if you were building out scenarios, if you're familiar with that process. The difference here is that with uncertainty vectoring, we can pick any one of those uncertainties and do a what if analysis. So what if interest rates go up to 10%? And because of the work we've done before to discuss how those uncertainties fit together, if you say, what if interest rates go up to 10%, you can automatically draw lines to track what is likely happen to the other uncertainties. Now recognize we're not trying to predict the future, we're just trying to create a potential story that would explain what will happen to these other uncertainties. And why this is particularly valuable is that it allows you to, in real time, react to an event that just happened today, to go in and look at all of those 10 uncertainties you worked with and said, well, if we said that the number of people applying for mortgages was going to go down, what we said was going to happen next is X. So now maybe we can start to think about what's our strategic action there.
It makes perfect sense to me. I think our listeners are going to find that very valuable. It's a great demonstration of a technique that I think is really valuable to them when they look at the future and trying to predict. Because scenario planning is still huge, and this is a way to kind of connect those dots in a unique and different way. Let's move to the backward forward flip. This is designed to help participants or the individual ask the question, what if they're making the same mistakes previous industry leaders made?
Yeah, and this one's actually not a very complex thing. It's a really kind of just a way to structure a series of questions in your team. It goes back to what we were talking about with not knowing that we didn't know something in the past. Or let's say your industry might be kind of falling into some traps, right? That there's some strategic decisions that have to be made. Do we want to invest in blockchain, right? Or something like that. And this tool or technique is really just a way to say, is there an example from our past that will inform our decision that we make today on this? So the way that we can think about that is there an example of a similar type of technological shift that occurred within our industry or organization that has some similarities to what we're facing right now? So if we're going to talk about, do we want to move towards a blockchain infrastructure? It could be something like, well, 4 years ago, we were discussing whether or not we're going to move everything to a cloud-based system from another sort of system in our organization. And so what the backward forward flip is you take your team and you just put them back in that original decision. Say, all right, let's take a look at that decision to move to the cloud from 4 years ago or 5 years ago. Now, what was the conventional wisdom in the industry at the time about why that was a good idea? Then the second question is, who are the people in the industry who thought that there was some real risk there? And why were people saying it wasn't a good idea? Now, 5 years later, do we have some insight about sort of the interaction between those questions? And are there some things we wished we had considered about those people who are advocating for it and those people who are advocating against it that maybe would have informed our decision better back then? You then take that discussion that you had about moving to cloud computing in this example, and you say, all right, now let's talk about blockchain. What is our industry now talking about? What is the conventional wisdom of moving towards blockchain? Who are the people and what are they saying about saying this might not be a good move and why? What's the similarity between this conversation and the conversation we were having about cloud computing? And based on that, are there questions we need to be asking now because we regret that we didn't ask them 5 years ago in this other example? So it's just a kind of a really simple set of kind of organized questions to give you some structure around this idea of making sure you actually are learning from a past story, a past example.
Thank you. Another great technique that I'm sure the people listening will have lots of value in. Is there one that we didn't talk about before we end today's episode that you thought our listeners or the leaders listening to this podcast might have some value in that they could use right away with everything going on in the world?
There's one I would mention, and then there's a second one I always give a plug for, which is not really mine, but it's one I talk about in the book that a lot of people use. And that is just always looking for a way to structure the way you think about your stakeholders. So I have a chapter in there where I do sort of talk about some of the ways that people do stakeholder analysis and the advantage of doing that. And so I'm always saying, make sure you're really thinking about how you analyze your stakeholders and understand their perspectives. But the one that, since I published that book, that I've found more and more value for is tension tracking. And it's just this idea of starting to recognize how in any organization, there are these tensions that tug against each other, and they cannot be, you really can't make them go away because they are part of the system that you are within. And so a common example of a tension would be a tension between the global part of your organization and the local part of your organization. So a local market versus the global market. And that's just kind of part of the design of the organization. And the nice thing about tension tracking is it gets us thinking about, if you are the manager who's in the middle of that tension, you feel that stress every day and people are pulling you in both directions. If what you think your job is to fix that as if you're fixing a problem, you will never succeed. and you will burn yourself out. And so rather what we like to think about is that we think about these as tensions that do exist. And your job as a manager is to essentially move back and forth along that tension, to make sure that you are actually engaging both sides, that you are being the translator, and that you are allowing yourself to not sort of be anchored in a position between these two tensions, but allowing yourself to slide back and forth. Sometimes you're more with the global side, sometimes you're more with the local side, and you ride it in some ways with that. So I find that it just is a useful way to sort of diffuse our stress a little bit when you start to look at this dysfunctional organization that you're in. And I'll say confidently that 99% of the people listening to this will nod and say, yeah, my organization is dysfunctional. That's what keeps me in business, is that it releases some of that stress when you accept the idea that some of these things just exist because of the overall system design that you are a part of. You can make things more effective by accepting those as sort of parts of the rules of the system rather than things that need to be fixed.
Love that. Thank you. As we reach the end of the episode, I always like to have a call to action. So, John, is there one thing that leaders listening today can take from this and start right away tomorrow? What would be the first step in overcoming this fundamental leadership trap?
For me, the first step is to tomorrow, when you go into work or when you step into your first meeting, remind yourself to look around with curiosity. That word curiosity is just so important. Just even thinking about the idea of walking into a room with curiosity means you're looking outside of yourself. And whatever that does is going to open you up to see something that you might not have immediately thought before. So I think that habit of just thinking about, am I curious? And how am I being curious is just a great way to get started in sort of, in breaking out of that cycle and breaking out of that trap.
Great advice. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
The easiest way is probably just to find me on LinkedIn, John Austin, and there's about 10,000 John Austins on LinkedIn. So look for the one that says he works at University of New England. The second way to get in contact with me is if you just search for John Austin at University of New England, I'll pop right up and I would be happy to talk to anyone who reaches out to me.
Well, thank you, John, for being the guest today on this episode. Love your book. Hopefully people will, as a result of this episode, you'll see a spike in book sales.
Well, I appreciate it. It's been great conversation. It's always great talking with you, Charles.
Thank you. And this concludes then this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. If you like what you heard today, please share this episode with your colleagues, friends, or anyone else who have found this valuable. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, it can be found both on Apple and Spotify, and it can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. Until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.